Hello, I'm Father Chuck Peak, rector in the interim at St. Mark's on the Campus Episcopal Church in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we're sitting in my office as we record another episode in the teaching series we call Big Red Doors. And this one is about the four last things. Many catechisms end talking about the last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell. And that seems like an awfully serious subject to undertake. How we have imagined the rewards of virtue and the wages of sin has changed often over the centuries, from the fiery garbage dump in Jerusalem to the fires of Dante's vivid imagination, from the orthodox image of a single figure totally isolated from human company on a stark and desolate shore, to the winged angels and bright halos of Western art. There is something in the human mind that wants some kind of justice, reward for virtue, punishment for sin. At least we often want it for others, even if not for ourselves. In Jesus' parables, all that justice is left entirely to God, removed from our purview. And it's not uncommon for us to find that apparently God is not usually willing to be the umpire in our virtue competitions. The book of Job is on that score the comeuppance of most of us sooner or later. But the gathering of heaven and hell into the fold of death and judgment has often been misappropriated by some, sometimes by whole generations or whole societies, into a scenario of gloom and doom. That says more about us and our judgmentalism than about why the Catechism ends on what are called these four last things. Who could have been more aware that there are last things than, say, the Christ, depicted in the 1960s and 70s in Godspell or Jesus Christ Superstar as anything but gloomy, or the Buddha, one of whose most famous representations is the laughing Buddha. So what do the four last things say to us that means that we're not in the midst of gloom and doom, but in the midst of something important to all of us? Part we know. We all die. It is the supreme blow to our egos, the final limitation on our idea that we can have it all. It is the fact behind the philosophy of carpe diem, seize the day. Live fully now because you won't live forever. Certainly what counts as living fully differs widely among us, from pleasure seeking to prayer, but the pleasure seeker and the prayerful may have more in common than we often think. Paul would add to that fact that we all die, that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. Neither Paul nor Christianity invented sin. Most everyone who ever lived gets some sense of right and wrong, and our odd wiring that inevitably leads us both sometimes to goodness and sometimes to sin. And so we all get some sense of shame or guilt. We all get sometimes a feeling of being judged or needing to be judged, of not measuring up. The four last things teach us what to do with this basic human experience. The church, as Chesterton taught, teaches us what to do about sin. The four last things also teach us moral seriousness. Our acts, our behaviors, our lives have consequences. What we choose shapes who we become. And C.S. Lewis reminds us that if there is a life after death, there is an infinite measure to the direction we have chosen. Our bad habits get so bad they become hell. Our good habits grow so luminously they become a heaven of happiness. True moral seriousness in some becomes judgmentalism or prudishness, or the Puritan notion that if you're enjoying something you must be sinning. But without any moral seriousness, then we are left adrift on our own life-denying or life-threatening whims and fancies. We are, in a word, dangerous to ourselves and to others, to the very idea of human society. I want what I want when I want it may feel good while we're wanting it. but eventually corrupts the human spirit. We are indeed each unique, but terminal uniqueness destroys the other things each of us is born to be, a social animal among them, interdependent on a complex fabric of threads and stitches that are holding us all somehow together. To rebel against injustice may be noble, but to rebel against the fabric of life is foolhardy and doomed. So the four last things are good reminders that we are sometimes the worst judges of how we might best be happy, what might best count as success, who we are meant to become. Last things remind us we are creatures, not the Creator, though creatures with our own creative capacities and potentials. The four last things get it right. Eyes on heaven, feet planted firmly on real ground. Neither angel nor beast. Beings who find that in God's perfect service we find our own perfect freedom. All this seems so easily forgotten or ignored, unless, of course, a frequent visit to the creeds and catechisms as we come regularly before the altar of God keeps us wholesomely reminded of the fundamental realities: death, judgment, heaven, hell. Thank you for joining another episode of The Big Red Door.